Hi everyone, I'm Kilian. I'm the creator of Polypane, and I've been building websites for a very, very long time, longer than 2008 even. I'm joining you here from rainy the Netherlands, and I guess we can just get started. So, responsive design. By now, it's a household term, right? It lets us adapt our websites to various screen sizes. It was introduced by Ethan Marcotte in an article on A List Apart, and that was actually over 11 years ago now. So we've been working with responsive design for a very long time. And while I'm sure all of you here today have some idea of what responsive design is, I wanted to get a definition on screen anyway. So responsive design is the way a website adapts to different screen sizes by reflowing and repositioning content as the available space allows. We do this using media queries and flexibly sized elements using relative minimum and maximum sizes. But more recently, Flexbox, Grid, and CSS functions like clamp and min-max have allowed us to do this in even easier ways. And of course, with container queries coming up, the need for media queries for responsive design is getting less and less important. But there was a time before all of this. So before responsive design, we did things a little differently. In 2008, I wrote an article on Naar Voren, a then well-known Dutch front-end website, on handheld style sheets, using the now deprecated handheld media type. Nowadays, the only two media types that are still around are screen and print, but back then we had dozens of them. Support back then for these handheld style sheets, even though it was the only way to create websites for mobile devices, was pretty terrible. There was just support in a handful of browsers like Opera and Mobile Internet Explorer, and each of those supported only a little bit of CSS. That's not really why I'm telling you this. I ended this article in 2008 with a glimmer of hope. Soon we will be able to use media queries that would allow us to respond to device widths, heights, and I really wrote this down, the number of colors on the screen. Back then, Opera 9 and Safari 3 already supported this new standard. Things have changed quite a bit since then. The mobile internet and media queries were here to stay. We're over a decade in now, and support for media queries is terrific. Every browser out there supports media queries, and we don't even really think about it. The term responsive design has also solidified. I think we have a pretty solid shared understanding nowadays of how responsive design should be approached. I think responsive design is mobile first. It uses media queries with widths in ems. It uses a base font size of 16 pixels, which is 1 rem. It allows for user resizing, zooming in and out. Scrolling is fine because there is no fault. There never was, but now everyone knows. As is tradition in web development, if we have something that works well and that everyone understands and that's supported everywhere, it's time to move on to something new that's maybe a little less well supported, combined with maybe a new term. So I think that could very well be responsive websites. In web development, we usually reason about what a device can do, but we really want to be responsive to the user, their environment, and their preferences. The device is really just a proxy for your visitor. So we want to actively adapt to user preferences with user preference media queries. So I think our website should respond to user preferences, their environment, their network condition, and of course, still their device capabilities. Today, we'll go over each of these and see what's possible in each of these categories. Not everything will be equally well supported, but for each feature, I'll share in which evergreen browser it already works. So very quickly throughout this presentation, I will use Polypane, which is the web browser that I make. So if you see a weird looking browser screenshot showing off a media query, that's Polypane. So first up are the user preferences. There's a lot of these, but half of them don't have great support yet. We'll go over them anyway, starting with prefers color scheme, or as most of us call it, dark mode. With prefers color scheme, a user can indicate whether they prefer a light or a dark version of your website. They might prefer a dark version because it's easier on their eyes, or a light version because it usually has increased contrast. So both of these can be beneficial to your visitor, depending on their preferences. Using the prefers color scheme media feature, we can check for both dark and light. There used to be a third option called no preference, but it got removed from the specification since it was essentially the same as light mode and browsers never implemented it any other way. Most of you will have a website in light mode, and adding a dark mode from scratch can be a big project. If you want to add dark mode, but you don't have a lot of time, then you can use something I call cheap dark mode. It works like this. We invert the entire page using the CSS invert filter. This makes everything that's dark light and the other way around. Unfortunately, what this also does is invert the hue. So anything that's blue becomes orange, for example. That's not great. You can't have your brand color suddenly be different. So we rotate the hue by 180 degrees, which means we end up back at the original hue. It won't match your colors perfectly because the lightness has still changed, but it's usually close enough. At this point though, images and videos will look pretty bad. So we need to fix that. And we can fix that by adding the same invert and same hue rotate filter, essentially negating the earlier one. At this point though, the background color hasn't changed along, so we add an explicit background color. This one's dark gray, but you can also add a little bit of color, depending on what works best for your site. I do advise not using full black, because that's usually too contrasting. Now, of course, this isn't perfect. It's not as good as a fully custom dark theme, but it will get you something decent in a few lines of code. And here's what that looks like. On the left, the regular site, and on the right, the cheap dark mode one. Not bad for a couple of lines of code. With the prefers reduce motion media query, users can indicate that they want to see less stuff happening on screen. The reason they want to do this can be things like motion sickness, vestibular disorders that can cause nausea and dizziness. The animations can also be too distracting to them due to something like ADD, or just that they don't have time to wait for your nice animations to finish. If a user has this turned on, it doesn't mean you can't show any motion, but you have to be mindful. Use motion only where it helps understanding, and prefer animations that fade rather than move. And of course, for videos, like Apple does, don't autoplay them. Prefers reduce motion media feature has two values: reduce motion or no preference. The best way to approach this is to consider motion as an enhancement. Design your site without motion and only add in animations when the user has no preference. But if that's not an option, or the site is already built, you can use the prefers reduce motion reduce option to instead turn off animations. For example, with cheap reduce motion. This way to turn off all animation is very crude, because it turns all animations and transitions off regardless of if they're animating motion or just fading. Now, if you look at this bit of code, you can see some weird values like -1 milliseconds. That's to make sure that the animations still play, just that they take 0 seconds. This way, any JavaScript APIs that depend on animation end or transition end will still be called. If you do this, make sure everything is still visible. For example, with transitions from transparent to opaque. And for videos, you should really turn off autoplaying. In JavaScript, you can use the window.matchMedia API to check if you should, for example, autoplay a video. The .matches property is a boolean that tells you if this media query matches or not. While the previous two media queries are supported across browsers, the next few have no or very limited support. So consider them a preview of upcoming media features. With prefers reduce transparency, users can indicate that they want to see text on solid backgrounds. They want this usually due to a visual impairment, making it hard to read text on patterned backgrounds. But it can also help people with dyslexia or concentration problems. Unfortunately, there is no browser support yet. Like reduce motion, there's two options and one support lens. Consider again to make the reduce case the default and only add your transparencies and backgrounds when the no preference media query matches. Almost as unsupported is prefers contrast. This indicates whether your user wants to show your site with less or more contrast. Visual impairments can make it difficult to pick up subtle differences in color. So people with that will prefer a higher contrast. Apologies. On the other hand, people with light sensitivity issues might prefer a screen with less harsh contrasts. Do note that wanting less transparency is not the same as more contrast. There are different media queries that solve different issues. I just said almost as unsupported, because the latest Safari technology preview supports prefers contrast with the more value, and that activates when a user turns on the increased contrast accessibility option in macOS. And in Chrome 96, the most recent version of Chrome, all versions are supported, though I'm not aware of any operating system level settings that can trigger prefers contrast less to match. There's an odd one out here, and that's prefers contrast custom. What does that mean? Like, less contrast makes sense, and more contrast makes sense. But if contrast is custom, is it then not more and also not less? Well, it used to be called prefers contrast forced, and it would match when forced colors was active, which is another media query that we'll cover in a few minutes. That keyword, prefers contrast forced, got removed, but now custom came in its place. And the reason they want to do this is that they want to provide a hook for multiple situations where a user would want reduced visual complexity in general, by making the valueless prefers contrast apply when forced colors is active as well. So what happens here is if you type at media prefers contrast without a value, it will match for less contrast, more contrast, and custom contrast. The idea is by giving one hook for all of these various situations, people can reduce the visual complexity of their site for all situations in one go. More contrast, less contrast, or forced colors. Personally, with adoption of user preference media queries already quite low, I think this is very confusing and also wouldn't really add much to the usage of this, but we'll see. So inverted colors is an option that is also only supported on macOS. You'll notice it doesn't start with prefers. That's because the operating system, which is macOS, and the browser, Safari, have already inverted all the colors for you. You might think you need to use this media query to then double invert images and videos like we did for the cheap dark mode, but Safari also already does this for you. You can, however, still U-shift your entire site to make sure that your brand colors are still followed. In general, I think prefers color scheme and the dark mode in macOS are more or less the successors to this setting and media query. The values look like this. It's either none or inverted. On the Windows side, we have forced colors, which map to the Windows High Contrast mode. Windows High Contrast mode lets users specify and override all the colors of their entire operating system. Usually, this is used to create high contrast black on white or white on black color schemes. But it can also be used for sepia or even wilder color schemes, because users can configure this as they want. So high contrast is a bit of a misnomer. This media query also doesn't start with prefers, because your browser has already overwritten all the colors on your site and has made everything uniform with the rest of your operating system. The active keyword will tell you if it's active or not. In addition, your browser will use the background color to determine if the forced color theme is a dark theme or a light theme, and will also make sure that prefers color scheme matches. Because all the colors have already been overwritten by the browser, there's not really much for you to do, except make sure that things like SVG icons are still visible, or that things that had a background color now have a border, because you don't know which color scheme the user decided to use. You can't use your own colors for this. Instead, you can use these CSS color names that map to different aspects of a UI. So canvas text for your text, button text for buttons, button face for the button background color, etc. So right now, when you search online, you'll find the advice that SVG icons will follow along with these colors when you use the current color CSS keyword. However, that's currently broken in Chromium browsers due to a specification change. A fix is coming, but for now, you have to set the color explicitly. But what if your colors are important? For example, when you're showing color swatches for a product in a web shop, you can opt out of forced colors with the forced colors adjust none CSS property and value. Make sure that you use that just for the elements where your chosen color is important, and definitely not for entire pages or sections. Use it sparingly. Now, these last three options may sound similar, but they do not serve the same purpose. Forced colors overrides all your styling to something your user wanted, often with significantly increased contrast. With prefers contrast, it's your job to increase the contrast, but the user would still like to see your design. And lastly, inverted colors has no such explicit goal. It was mostly used to make screens less bright. The light level media query lets us respond literally to the user's environment. The operating system will tell browsers, once support lands, whether the environment the user is in is dark, normal, or bright, like you're in broad daylight. There's 3 values for this media query. Dim is for a dark environment, normal for an average one, and washed for a bright environment. Operating systems already use light sensors to dim or brighten the screen. And on your site, you could use them to decrease the blues when it's dark or increase the text contrast when it's bright, so that text still remains readable on a screen reflecting a lot of light. Not everyone is lucky enough to have fast or reliable internet or unlimited data plans. Browsers today can already send the save data on header, and web servers can then choose to send smaller images and videos and disable any form of preloading, server push, or polling. Doing this on a server level is often hard to do because you, as a developer, lack access to the server configuration, or the configuration requirements are just too complex. That's unfortunate because it can have a big impact on who gets to see and use your website. Coming up is the prefers reduced data media query. It's not available in browsers yet, but you can emulate it after changing some settings in Chrome and out of the box in Polypane. Though you can do less with it than the save data header, which would let you send essentially an entirely different website from your server. This is much easier to use. In your CSS, you can prevent downloading fonts and background images or swap them out for smaller images. And in JavaScript, with the Mesh Media API that I showed earlier, you can prevent preloading, polling, and autoplaying video. We don't have the time today to get into it, but check out the blog post I wrote about this at bit.ly/prefers-reduced-data. Even though prefers reduced data is not available yet, you can detect the save data header in JavaScript with the navigator.connection API and use that to prevent any preloading from happening. It's available in Chromium and behind a flag in Firefox. The API can also tell you if someone is on a slow connection with the effective type property. This doesn't just check the type of connection, but also the connection speed and how long it took to connect to the server, to give you an approximate connection type. Combine these to test for a preference to use less data or a connection that will benefit from less data being transferred. Even though the device is a proxy to the user and their preferences, we're also getting more information about the device and its capabilities. 2 of these are screen inset and interaction media queries. So with the advent of notched phones, Apple introduced a new viewport property called viewport fit cover. Without it, your site would be shown with these ugly bands on the left and right side of the screen to prevent your site from being covered up by a notch. When you turn it on, your site goes from edge to edge, but the notch now sits over the content. And since you don't know how large the notch is and on which side it is, Apple came up with a solution. Apple introduced a new set of CSS environment variables that you can use in your CSS to make sure your content isn't obscured by a notch or other overlaid UI. You can use them in the same way you use CSS variables. Android phones, of course, also got notches, so this feature is also available in Chrome for Android. Note that these environment variables don't provide any extra padding. So if you use just these, your content will be flush against the edge. But you can combine them with the calc function to have some default padding. Lastly, I want to point out the interaction media queries. These are supported across the board in all evergreen browsers. We have many different input devices nowadays compared to when the web just got started. Mouses, of course, still exist, But we also have touch, styluses, external controllers like a Wii controller, and even things like hand detection with Kinect or AR glasses. Things that are easy to do with a mouse can be harder with these other devices. Hovering might not be available, and precisely clicking something might be next to impossible. With these media queries, you can adapt to these input devices in clever ways. Consider touch devices as the most minimal. It doesn't have hover, and your input device is your thumb, making it hard to point precisely at a small target. From there, devices with a stylus add precision, but still no hover. And Wii controllers add hover, but no precision. And lastly, a mouse or touchpad has both hover capabilities as well as precise clicking. Now, these media queries only check the primary input device, but the user might use multiple input devices on a single computer. So make sure your UI works well with all of them. You can check for all input devices with the any-hover and any-pointer media queries. That's a roundup of the new and upcoming ways we can respond to user preferences, their network environment, and device capabilities. With these, we can optimize and personalize the experience visitors have with your website by responding to their preference, creating truly responsive websites. I'm Kilian Velkov. You can find me at kilianvelkov.com and on Twitter as @KilianVelkov.
So first of all, I want to ask, like in the very first segment, you covered a lot of preferences, the prefers something. So for some of those, I could understand that, okay, the reasons are very like apparent. For example, if you're talking about folks who want to concentrate or who have issues with a lot of disruption or motion, but some of those were not that clear to me. What's the exact use case for things like using forced colors or let's say inverted colors?
For inverted colors, and I'll just quickly switch back to that. Inverted colors, I think, is essentially deprecated. It existed in macOS and macOS only before they had dark mode in their operating system. So it was genuinely just a way to make the entire screen darker. So it was a personal preference. Like if you have light sensitivity issues and most of the websites are black text on a white background, which they are, then that's not a very pleasant experience. So by simply inverting your entire operating system, the majority of the web would be like more readable to you. So for forced colors, there's actually a wide range of reasons why people want to do this. And roughly 4% or 1 in 25 of your visitors have this turned on. So it's not an insignificant amount. Quite a lot of people that use this. The great thing about forced colors is predictability. Every website on your device will have the same text color, the same background color, the same link color, the same button color. Everything will look similar and everything will look in a way that doesn't negatively affect you. Again, say you are prone to migraines when you see white lights too much. Then again, the majority of the web is going to suck. Wikipedia, it's all black text on a white background. If you get a migraine after spending 10 minutes on Wikipedia, that's not great. So with forced colors, you can guarantee that any website will be its light text on a dark background, for example. And that's not something you can guarantee just by saying like, I prefer dark mode, because it's a preference, it's not a requirement. So that's why forced colors is so important.
I have one more question for you, Kilian. So I'm a student developer and I just came to understand all these terms today. I'm sure a lot of developers would not have any idea about all these user preferences existing out there. So as a developer, what would you say, like how should a designer and a developer should like start on the journey about learning these concepts and actually using them in their code to make the user experience better? Because as you mentioned, a lot of people are using these user preferences. So yeah, what should be the general roadmap for helping them get started in this area?
Yeah, there's a lot of these, right? And as a developer, you have finite time. There's deadlines. Your employer won't let you like endlessly spend time on a website. So you need to make choices. when you do, I think it's important to make choices that benefit your visitors the most. So that means that, and I'll quickly move back. Dark mode is super cool, but it's actually not that important. If you have to choose between adding a dark mode and making sure that your website doesn't trigger nausea and dizziness in your visitors, then spend the time making sure your website doesn't make your visitors physically ill, rather than making sure that you have a nice theme. So if you have finite time, try to focus on the parts of your site that will make your visitors' experience better. And that's making sure that prefers reduced motion is adhered to. And you can very easily do that by adding, this cheap reduced motion. It will work 99% of the time. Of course, it will be better to handcraft this and to make sure that for each specific animation, you make a choice. But again, you don't always have the time for that, so make smart choices there. And then again, make sure that you check your site for forced colors. You do need a Windows device for this, but turning on forced colors is not that difficult. You go to your settings, then the ease of access section, and then there's a tab called high contrast, which you can click and turn it on. And the nice thing about forced colors is because the operating system already changes everything for you, you don't really have to do a lot of work. So usually what it amounts to is, as I mentioned, making sure that SVG icons are still visible. And if you use things with background colors to differentiate them, for example, buttons. So in the screenshot now, you can see a button in the top right of the web page. That's not quite as clear in the forced colors mode because, the background is just gone, or it's not gone. It has the same background color as all the other things with backgrounds, which happens to be the entire page as well. So what you want to do there is identify where that happens and then just add a border or an outline. Just do outline 1 pixel, and that will then draw a little line around it. And you can use that to have that differentiation. And that's like a single line of CSS. And you make your website work better for people who have forced colors turned on. So in general, pick the things that really make a difference. And then if you have time left, do the cool stuff like a dark mode.
Got it. Prioritizing all the way. So we have some more questions on the chat. So people here, the folks are relating with the migraine issue that you mentioned and how 1 billion people are affected with migraine. And they want to know where can they learn more about these things and how web developers can, deal with these problems with having with people having migraine or the other issues that you mentioned. So are there some learning resources or support groups that you can just seek and understand the user? Because I think the key thing that Kilian you have achieved here is you have understood exactly what the end user wants. And how did you exactly. Got to know about this entire process? So
there's a few resources for this. So I wrote a really long blog post about everything there's to know about media queries, which you can find on the Polypane blog. So polypane.app/blog, and then scroll down a little until you see something called the complete guide to media queries. It'll take you over 20 minutes to read everything, but then you've read everything. Other resources, or another resource that I very frequently recommend, is the Mozilla Developer Network. So developer.mozilla.org. It's also sometimes called MDN. And that has very good in-depth info as well as browser support for each of these media queries.
That sounds great. Hopefully that answers the questions of the attendees. And one more thing that another question that we have here is about these queries. So folks who are just wanting to code this into I think you shared the code snippets in your presentation. So are they are they ready to go? Can we just incorporate them as it is and we can just get started, right?
Anything, so
are there any other resources, as you mentioned in your Polyplane blog? So can we refer that or somewhere to actually see it in action, code repository or something?
Again, same answers. Like in my blog post, I have a lot of code examples. MDN always has a lot of code examples. The nice thing about these media queries, and I didn't actually mention this in the talk, but because of the way CSS works, you can add these media queries right now. For example, the reduce data media query, and you can use that to prevent downloading a background image. And now, when no browser supports that, it won't do anything. So that image will still get downloaded and it'll work just fine. It won't crash or anything. And then when browsers add support for that media query, it will magically start working. So you can add code now where it won't take you a lot of time and your website won't benefit from it right now, but it will get better in the future without you having to do extra work in the future. And that's great. And that's because of the way CSS works, where if it encounters a media query it doesn't understand, it's just I don't understand this, but I'm just gonna move on. So I think that's a really powerful way to approach this. You can add stuff now when it's not a lot of effort, and then it'll just start working in the future.
Yeah, I mean, that is an absolutely amazing point that you raised. And I think this is something that we discussed with Hide as well in the accessibility talk, is to start coding things right in from the very beginning. So at the very last, you don't have to code everything in. And as you mentioned, all of these elements, because the power of CSS, they will just start working magically. So just from the get-go, whenever you're coding, folks, just make sure that you build accessible, responsive websites from the very beginning.
Exactly.
So we have a question from Sarag, and I think this is because of your, your amazing, how I don't even know how to say it, over a decade of experience of working with web development, and he wants some advice that he can use to get started in this web development field.
So I don't really have a clever answer for that. It's just try a lot of stuff. Try to build something or rebuild something cool that you find. See if you can figure out how it works. Building stuff, seeing what works, seeing what you don't like, and then trying to improve that. Don't expect things to be perfect the first time round, obviously. Just try to make small steps and take each exercise as something to improve the previous exercise on.
Building on top of this, another question we have is about 5 tools you would recommend for web developers.
So Polypane, every web developer in the entire world should use Polypane. It's filled to the brim with tools that help you with responsive design, accessibility, and general website quality, speed, web vitals, meta tags, etc. Building good websites is doing 1,000 small things right, which is great because that's much easier to improve than having to do one very large thing right. And then in terms of other tools, I really don't use a lot. So I have a code editor and I have Polypane, and I don't really use other tools, but there are things that are universally important. So make sure you check the accessibility of your website. And there's a couple of tools that do this. Again, Polypane does it, but you can also use Lighthouse, you can also use X, you can also use Wave, you can also use the Microsoft Accessibility Insights, webpagetest.org that you can use to test not just for accessibility, but also performance, website speed, your web vitals. There's things like ssltest.com that will tell you if your secure connection is configured correctly. There's, of course, the W3C validator, which will tell you if your HTML is valid. As you build, try to make it a habit to use these various tools to verify your responsiveness, your accessibility, your validation, etc. So that would be my answer.
All right. So just to add one more thing on top of it is, do you use build tools, and which one would you recommend? Another question by our attendees.
Whatever works for you. There are a dozen build tools out there and they're all great. Right now, I tend to use Webpack a lot, but that's just because the projects that I have set up, I set up when I was working with Webpack. And it works, so I'm not touching it anymore. It's just there and it does its job. I think Vite is very interesting as a build tool. There's a lot of stuff coming out nowadays. Build tools built with Go or with Rust that are supposedly much faster. There's new packers like Snowpack and Skypack that make it easier to import things. It doesn't really matter if you still use Grunt or Gulp and it works for you, and you have your build step in there and you have SAS and whatever. That also works. Like all tools don't stop working. Find something that fits with you, fits with the way you think, and use it.
All right, amazing answer. So just to summarize, look for tools in the areas of responsive design and accessibility, and Polypane works great for both of those. And you can also look into Wave and the other options that you mentioned. Look for speed.
Yeah, Xcore, Microsoft Accessibility Insights,
Yeah.
Lighthouse, so web.dev/measure will also do accessibility testing for you.
Yeah. So and moving on to the second point, for speed and optimizing performance, you can check out Lighthouse. You can check out web page test, and for security, the SSL site that you mentioned. And for build tools, as long as, and the one that you're using is Webpack, but as you mentioned, new tools coming every day. Just use the one that works for you. And thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.